Module 4, the Global Climate Finance Architecture. Every year, tens of thousands of people gather at a summit called the COP, and out of it come decisions with names like the NCQG and the Baku to Belém Roadmap. Then, somehow, over months and years, some of those words turn into an actual grant reaching an actual adaptation project in a rural province. Between the summit hall and the village lies an entire system, a set of goals, institutions, and channels. This module gives you the map of that system, so you never again feel lost about who decides, who holds the money, and how it's supposed to reach you. By the end, you'll understand three things. First, the governance layer on top, the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement and the yearly COP, and what it actually does. Second, the arc of the big global finance goals over time and what each one means. And third, the high-level map of the actors who move the money, the funds, the development banks, the bilateral donors, and the private sector, so that the detailed modules ahead have a frame to hang on. Let's start at the top with governance. Who's actually in charge of climate finance globally? The honest answer is that no one is fully in charge, but the closest thing to a steering wheel is the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the treaty signed in Rio back in 1992 that we met in Module 1. Nearly every country in the world is a member. And once a year, those countries meet at the Conference of the Parties, which everyone just calls the COP. COP simply means that annual meeting of all the treaty's member countries. When you hear COP 29 or COP 30, it's just the 29th and 30th of these yearly gatherings. Sitting under that umbrella is the Paris Agreement, adopted at COP 21 in 2015, which set the temperature goals and the modern structure where every country brings its own plan. So picture a layered thing. The UNFCCC is the foundational treaty. The Paris Agreement is the key deal made under it. And the COP is the annual meeting where the members negotiate and take decisions. That's the governance layer. Now, what does this layer actually do on finance in practical terms? Three things, and it's worth being precise because it's easy to overestimate its power. The first thing it does is set the goals. The COP is where countries collectively agree on the big finance targets, the 100 billion, and now the 300 billion. It's the place where the world says, out loud and together, this is how much should flow. The second thing it does is establish and steer the funds. Several of the major climate funds were created by decisions at these meetings, and the COP gives them broad guidance, telling them, for instance, to balance adaptation and mitigation, or to prioritize the most vulnerable. The third thing it does is set the rules of the system, the transparency rules for reporting finance, and frameworks like the one for carbon markets will meet in Module 13. But here's the crucial limit, and you must internalize it. The COP largely cannot force anyone to hand over money. It sets goals and gives guidance, but the actual dollars come from the budgets of individual developed countries, which they control, and from institutions that have their own separate governance. So the COP is more like a body that sets collective expectations and applies political and moral pressure than a treasury that writes checks. That gap between what's agreed in the hall and what's actually paid is precisely why the 100 billion goal could be promised at a COP and then missed for years. Nobody at the COP could compel payment. Hold that limit in mind, it explains a great deal of the frustration you'll encounter. If the COP can't actually force countries to pay, then what's the point of these goals? Why do developing countries fight so hard over a number that isn't even binding? Because the number, even when it's not legally enforceable, is enormously powerful as a benchmark and a lever. Once the world has collectively agreed on a figure, it becomes the yardstick every country is measured against, publicly, every single year. Developing countries can point to it and say, you promised 300 billion, here's what you actually delivered, and hold the gap up for the whole world to see. It shapes what donors budget for, it drives the reporting, it structures the pressure. So the fight over the number is really a fight over the strength of the yardstick they'll be able to hold up for the next decade. A bigger, clearer number is a stronger lever. That's why every word of these goals is contested so fiercely. It's not idle. It's the tool of accountability itself. Now let me give you the arc of those goals over time, cleanly, because they build on each other and you'll refer to them constantly. Think of it as 3 chapters. The first chapter is the 100 billion. As we covered in Module 1, developed countries pledged at Copenhagen in 2009 to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020. It was missed in 2020, missed again in 2021, and first met in 2022 at about $115.9 billion, reported by the OECD in May of 2024, 2 years late. That's the old anchor, and its lateness is the root of much of today's distrust. The second chapter is the new goal, agreed at COP29 in Baku in November of 2024. It's called the New Collective Quantified Goal, the NCQG, and it has 2 layers you must keep distinct because people constantly confuse them. The inner layer, the firm commitment, is that developed countries take the lead in mobilizing at least $300 billion a year by 2035 for developing countries. The outer layer, the aspiration, is a call to scale up climate finance to $1.3 trillion a year by 2035, from all sources, public and private together. So the $300 billion is the part developed countries are on the hook to lead, and the $1.3 trillion is the total the world hopes will flow once private money is counted in. Think of it as a hard inner core of public commitment wrapped in a softer outer shell of total ambition. Developing countries widely called the $300 billion too low and too slow. So this chapter, too, opens in disappointment. The third chapter is the most recent, COP30, held in Belém, in Brazil, in November of 2025, whose decision was named the Global Muturo, a Brazilian word for a community coming together to work. A few things from it matter for you. It calls for efforts to triple adaptation finance by 2035, measured against a 2025 baseline, a direct response to how starved adaptation has been. It takes note of the Baku to Belém roadmap to $1.3 trillion, which is a document the 2 summit presidencies produced on how the world might actually reach that trillion-plus figure. And note the careful verbs. It calls for efforts and takes note. Language that signals encouragement rather than binding obligation, exactly the softness we discussed. On adaptation, countries adopted 59 of a proposed 100 indicators for measuring progress, with explicit language that these create no new financial obligations, plus a 2-year period to refine the rest. And notably, no formal fossil fuel phase-out roadmap made it into the core text. The presidency said that a deforestation roadmap would be advanced separately. So the arc runs 100 billion, then 300 billion nested in 1.3 trillion, then the tripling of adaptation and the roadmap toward the trillion. 3 chapters, each building on the last. Now to the third piece of your map, the actors who actually move the money. Because the COP sets goals but doesn't disperse, the real work is done by a set of institutions below it. Let me give you the 4 families at a high level. Each gets its own dedicated module later, so here I just want you to see the shape of the whole, the way you'd glance at a map before a journey. The first family is the multilateral climate funds, institutions created specifically to channel climate money, jointly owned by many countries. The flagship is the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, the largest dedicated multilateral climate fund, set up under the UNFCCC in 2010 and based in Songdo, South Korea. Its most recent replenishment, its second, covering 2024 to 2027, raised about $12.8 billion in pledges, and it aims to split its money 50-50 between mitigation and adaptation, with half of the adaptation share going to the most vulnerable, the least developed countries, the small island states, and Africa. Alongside it sit others, the older and broader Global Environment Facility, the GEF, which handles biodiversity and land and chemicals as well as climate, and which hosts special adaptation funds for the poorest countries. The Adaptation Fund, which pioneered a model called direct access. The Climate Investment Funds, housed at the World Bank. And the newest arrival, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, agreed in principle at COP27 in 2022 and operationalized at the end of 2024. Money for climate harms that can no longer be adapted to entirely new territory. A few concrete details on that one, because it's the frontier and you'll be asked about it. The World Bank is its interim host and trustee, at least for now. Its host country is the Philippines. Its first executive director, Ibrahima Cheikh Diong, took up the role in November of 2024. And the early pledges into it have been on the order of several $100 million, which sounds like a lot until you remember the harms it's meant to address run into the hundreds of billions. So it exists, it's real, the first money is starting to flow around 2025 and 2026, and it is tiny relative to the need. That combination, real but far too small, describes much of this family. Module 5 is devoted to all of it, the GCF and the GEF and the Adaptation Fund and the Climate Investment Funds and this newest fund, how each one differs and how you actually reach them. The second family, and this is the one that moves the most money by far, is the Multilateral Development Banks, the MDBs. These are the big international banks owned by groups of governments, and they deliver the largest share of international public climate finance, more than the dedicated funds. The most important for you are the World Bank Group, and in your region, the Asian Development Bank, the ADB, which has committed to providing $100 billion of cumulative climate finance from its own resources between 2019 and 2030. The reason these banks are so central is a piece of financial machinery we'll unpack fully in Module 6. They can take the capital their member governments put in and use it to borrow far more on global markets, multiplying it. So a modest amount of government money becomes a large amount of lending. Hold that as a teaser. It's why the banks, not the funds, are the true giants of climate finance. The third family is the bilateral donors and their development finance institutions. Bilateral just means from one country directly to another, as opposed to multilateral, which means pooled among many. These are national agencies, Germany's KfW and GIZ, France's AFD, Japan's JICA, the UK's Development Finance Institution, the United States Development Finance Corporation, and others. Some give aid and grants, some make loans and investments, and I should flag the current climate. Some donors, notably the United States, have been retrenching their development finance and aid in this period, which matters for what's available. Module 7 covers this family. And the fourth family is the private sector, the commercial banks, the companies, and the great ocean of institutional investors, the pension funds and insurers, whose trillions the whole, billions to trillions, strategy is trying to mobilize. They're not a climate institution at all. They're ordinary capital that the rest of the architecture is trying to attract into climate projects, on the terms we studied in Modules 2 and 3. Now, one practical thread to tie the whole map to you, sitting in a ministry in a developing country. How does a country actually plug into all of this? The key connector is usually a designated office inside government, often called the National Designated Authority, the country's official focal point for the climate funds, especially the Green Climate Fund. Think of it as the front door and the switchboard, the body that says yes, this proposal has our country's backing, and that helps steer which projects go forward. Around it sit accredited entities, the organizations, national or international, allowed to actually receive and manage the fund's money, a distinction we'll unpack fully in Module 15. I mention it now only so the architecture doesn't feel like a distant sky of institutions with no ladder up to it. There is a ladder. It runs through your own government's focal point and the entities accredited to carry the money. And learning to climb, it is the practical payoff of this entire course. This is a lot of institutions, funds, banks, bilaterals, private money. Isn't all this fragmentation a problem in itself? Why so many separate bodies? It absolutely is a problem, and you've put your finger on one of the real pains of the field. The system grew up piece by piece over 30 years, each fund created by a different decision to solve a different political moment, so what we have is not a clean design, but an accumulation. For a practitioner in a developing country, that fragmentation is a genuine burden. Each fund has its own application process, its own rules, its own reporting demands, and a small ministry can exhaust itself just navigating them all. This is one of the live reform debates, and there's a whole movement associated with the Bridgetown Initiative led by Barbados, pushing to simplify and reform the international financial architecture, cheaper capital, more lending headroom for the banks, debt relief for countries hit by disasters. We'll dig into all of that in the final module. So yes, the complexity is real, it's costly, and it's contested, and part of becoming skilled in this field is learning to navigate a system that, frankly, no one would design this way from scratch. So, to bring it together, on top sits the governance layer, the UNFCCC treaty, the Paris Agreement under it, and the yearly COP, which sets the goals, establishes and steers the funds, and makes the rules, but which crucially cannot force anyone to pay. The goals run in 3 chapters. The old 100 billion met 2 years late. The new 300 billion by 2035 nested inside a 1.3 trillion aspiration agreed at Baku. And COP30's call to triple adaptation finance and its roadmap toward the trillion. And below the governance sit 4 families of actors who actually move the money: the dedicated climate funds like the GCF, the multilateral development banks that move the most of all, the bilateral donors and their agencies, and the vast private sector the whole system is trying to draw in. You now have the full map, the goals, the governance, and the actors. From here, we go one level deeper into each part of it, beginning with the dedicated climate funds themselves, the GCF and its siblings, in Module 5.